Hey folks, guess what? So we've gone through our first 5 philosophers, and thus far it's been poor Thomas Hobbes all by himself in classical conservative land. Well, guess what? Today, when we get to number 6, when we talk about Edmund Burke, he's finally getting a friend, right? So he's no longer going to be alone on Isolation Island in classical conservatism world all by himself. So today, guys, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke, he's kind of a big deal, right? And there's a video in this PowerPoint, which I'll point out, which I want to make sure you watch. Burke is considered to be, as it is mentioned on the slide here, the father of the conservative movement, okay? So who is he? What did he do? So, guys, Burke, first of all, was an Irishman, right? He was an Irishman, and he was also an author. He was an orator, meaning a public speaker, and he's considered to be the father of classical conservatism, right? He's considered to be the father of classical conservatism. That's important. When we think classical conservative, I want you to think 2 people. Number 1, Burke for sure, and then number 2, of course, Thomas Hobbes, okay? Now look, guys, Burke's, we'll look at it at the end of the PowerPoint, but like, again, if you remember, one message I'm trying to hammer home to you is that the idea of humans are reactions to things going on around them, right? We mentioned how Thomas Hobbes and his conservative ideology, his theory, was born from the English Civil War, right? We mentioned how John Locke and his liberal ideology and his philosophy of humanity, saying people are reasonable and rational, right, and generally good, came from the fact that he witnessed the Glorious Revolution, which was essentially bloodless and achieved its goals without any real loss of life, right, at least in large numbers. Edmund Burke, what he witnessed that turned him into a conservative, right, which got him advocating for a conservative position, was the French Revolution, right? And we'll talk about which part of it in particular, because, I mean, guys, the French Revolution lasted for a long time, right? It didn't just happen overnight. It was an event that lasted years and years and years. And there was a more moderate phase, then we get to the radical phase, right? And then we get Napoleon, and you could argue that the revolution continues on from there, right? Up until we have France established as a true constitutional republic, right? Okay, now, guys, here's the interesting thing about Burke. Like, a lot of people think that, you know, knowing a little bit about Burke, that he was against the French Revolution, and as a result, he must have been against all revolutions, and that, in fact, is not true. So, chronologically speaking, the American Revolution, of course, comes first, right? American Revolution began on the 4th of July, 1776. 13 years later, we get the French Revolution. With that being said, guys, Burke actually viewed the American Revolution, which preceded or came before the French Revolution, as a legitimate revolution because of the grievances of the people in the 13 colonies. He saw King George of Great Britain and his view on taxation and the tyranny that was happening in that country as a legitimate form of grievance on the part of the people in the 13 colonies. When you have a grievance, you have like real claim for harm being done against you. So he viewed the American Revolution as legitimate because the people in the 13 colonies had real grievances with King George. However, when it comes to the French Revolution, Burke didn't see that kind of hardship that the people in the American 13 colonies were experiencing, which ultimately led them to revolution on the other side of the pond, right? So he advocated the American Rev, but he was appalled and horrified by the violence of the French Revolution. In particular, if you remember your French Revolution history, that so-called Reign of Terror. right? The so-called Reign of Terror. Now, was there other violence during the French Revolution? Absolutely, right? And we'll look at some examples of that here. But it was truly the Reign of Terror, where during the rule of Robespierre, anyone who wasn't rah-rah enough for the French Revolution was seen as an enemy of the revolution, right? If you just expressed mild support for the revolution, then you'd be branded an enemy of the revolution because you weren't being fervent enough in terms of your support. And of course, people who weren't supporting the revolution enough in the eyes of Robespierre had their heads chopped off by the guillotine, right? So the March on Versailles, this is really where Burke sees the French Revolution becoming derailed, right? And I don't know if you remember or not, the March on Versailles, this is where the ladies in the fish markets took their pikes, right, that they used to like sling fish around, and they marched from Paris to Versailles, and they basically dragged King Louis back to Paris so that he could see the misery inside the city. And he believed that the French experiment in democracy, that being trying to instigate or create sort of liberal structures in that country, was really a form of tyranny, right? It was really a form of tyranny. Because again, guys, I mean, how can you justify and say that, you know, we believe in liberal ideals when people are being slaughtered in the streets via the guillotine, right? So when one considers the Reign of Terror, maybe Burke was right. Maybe the French Revolution and the violence that occurred in it was, in fact, a type of tyranny of the majority of French people, right? So this image here shows us the March on Versailles, where again, these burly fishmongering women from the fish markets of Paris marched to Versailles to drag King Louis back to Paris. And at that point, once he came back to Paris, he was a virtual prisoner of the revolution. I mean, his fate was sealed, right? Eventually, he gets his head cut off by the guillotine as well. All right. So the book that he wrote, or the pamphlet that he wrote, kind of important, right? If you understand the name of this book, then you, I would argue, probably more so will remember what his theory was all about. So, guys, Burke, he watched and was informed of the violence of the French Revolution while he was living on the other side of the English Channel, right, in Ireland. And he wrote a book called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And guys, in this book, Burke cautions people on the dangers of the idea of change, right, which inherently makes him a conservative. We know that conservatives are generally against change. And basically Burke's argument, and there's a video that's in this and I'll point it out, Burke's argument is that, okay, you want change, but how do you know that the change you're going to create, in fact, doesn't make things worse, right? Doesn't make things worse. At least what we get from, you know, tradition and from, you know, focus on the past and things like that is a proven way to organize society, right? So the main question that we get regarding Edmund Burke on the diploma exam is this idea of time-tested authority. And really, guys, the only time-tested form of authority that we had prior to, like, these new sort of liberal ideals was monarchy, right? Again, we know that classical conservatism, which Burke argues for and advocates for, has been sort of the way that European society was organized since, you know, the beginning of the so-called Dark Ages, right? The medieval period, the feudal period. So we're going back to about the year 500. And this new democracy idea that people are having, this new liberal ideal that people are having, is it going to work? Well, what if it doesn't? What if it creates chaos? So guys, in his work, he spoke of the dangers of shunning political authority, which at that time was feudal and absolute. So he said that, you know what, you might not like a king, but at least this society is orderly and predictable. And I mean, look at what's going on in France, right? Is that better than what you had before? Burke argued absolutely not. He saw the chaos that was the radical phase of the French Rev as tyranny, and he advocated for a return to feudal order. Why? Because it was better, right? It was better. Feudal order, quite simply, was better, right? It was better. And for all intents and purposes, Burke is considered the man when it comes to classical conservatism. He said man needs tradition and time-tested forms of authority, right? Which is what I mentioned up here. So tradition and time-tested forms of authority. That's what Burke was all about. And he wanted to ensure that people and their sort of new liberal ideals, which people are really excited about, right? It's great to be excited, but again, how do we know it's not going to be worse? So don't fall for the whims of passion. I know sometimes we get excited, we get swept up in things, but whoa, pump the brakes there, son, right? Pump the brakes a little bit, and maybe, just maybe, things will actually end up being more terrible than they are now with our changes. So that's Edmund Burke right there, right? Keep tradition alive and rockin' progress, right, in quotes, is in fact chaos. And this video, I highly, highly, highly encourage you. It's not just there because, I wanted to put a link up on the screen. It's there because I want you to watch it. Watch the videos. They help give context to what we're looking at here. I showed this to my students every single year that I teach this stuff. Make sure you have a look at it, okay? It's a very, very good video. Okay, so let's talk really quickly about classical conservatism. So guys, classical conservatism really wasn't born until classical liberalism existed and came to the forefront. Yes, I know I called Thomas Hobbes a classical conservative, but really, Hobbes had no real classical liberalism to sort of shake his fist at and be like, boo, right? You're a conservative when there's liberals that are proposing change. And during Hobbes' time, that didn't really exist. However, during Burke's time, there was these new liberal ideals like the French Revolution and trying to radically change society that was going on. And classical conservatism, guys, I want you to think of it as a reaction to and against classical liberalism. Remember, people are reactions to things going on around them. Classical liberals look at the way the world is at that time. They see tyranny, they see oppression, and they want something different. They're reacting against that tyranny and oppression. Classical conservatives are reacting against what classical liberals want to achieve, right? And generally, it's people who are monarchists, people who are royalists that believe in classical conservatism. So classical conservatives reacting to the new liberal thinking that looked to shed the chains of feudalism and create an egalitarian world based on merit. By the way, this word egalitarianism or egalitarian, you might want to write it down. It's just a really fancy way to say equality. Right? It's just a fancy way to say equality. And merit, right? This idea of merit means, it doesn't matter what social class you're born in, you can become something more. So title, being, a member of the Bourbon family, being related to someone who is a member of the royal family, that shouldn't matter in a merit-based society, right? In a merit-based society, how hard you work and the value you add to society will determine how high you go up in that socioeconomic system. And guys, classical conservatives distrust change and wanted society based on tradition and established institutions. And again, for them, this means monarchy. Right? This means monarchy. And why? Because it just appeared more stable to them, right? It was proven to have organized society for the past 1,200 years, 1,300 years at that time, right, when Burke was writing. And as a result, again, pump the brakes, slow down, really think about what you're doing before you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? All right, so that's Edmund Burke, ladies and gentlemen. So again, Hobbes finally has a friend. All right, let's just keep going. Now it's going to get really good with our friend John Stuart Mill, and then we're going to look at two economic philosophers, that being Adam Smith and also Karl Marx, the papa of communism. Okay, love you guys. Peace as always. Stay cool, and we'll see you again.